There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a wetland at dusk. The kind where frogs should be calling, where raccoons should be rustling in the cattails, where white-tailed deer should be stepping cautiously toward the water's edge. For decades, that silence described the Florida Everglades. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Something had come in the night, eaten the noise, swallowed the movement, and left a wilderness that looked intact from the air but was hollowing out from within. That something was the Burmese python. And by the time most people understood what was happening, it was almost too late to care. The Burmese python is not native to Florida. It does not belong in the sawgrass marshes of South Florida, in the blackwater sloughs of the Everglades, or in the mangrove forests edging the coast. It belongs in the forests and grasslands of Southeast Asia, where it evolved over millions of years alongside predators that could match it, prey that could evade it, and environmental pressures that kept its numbers in check. But during the 1980s and into the 1990s, a booming exotic pet trade brought tens of thousands of these animals into American homes, where buyers underestimated just how fast a small snake grows. Within a few years, manageable pets became unmanageable giants, some stretching past 12, 14, even 16 feet, and frightened or overwhelmed owners made a decision that would alter an entire ecosystem. They let the snakes go. Some released their pythons intentionally. Others may have lost them during natural disasters. Anecdotal accounts point to Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which reportedly destroyed a reptile breeding facility near Homestead and released a surge of snakes into the wild. Regardless of how it happened, by the mid-1980s, Burmese pythons were already appearing in Everglades National Park. By 2000, multiple generations had been born in the wild, and a breeding population had taken hold so firmly that no natural force in the American ecosystem was equipped to stop it. Florida's native wildlife had no reference point for this predator. The eastern United States had not been home to a constricting snake of this size for millions of years. Raccoons, opossums, rabbits, deer, creatures that had evolved entirely without that threat, simply did not behave defensively around the python. They did not flee. They did not recognize the danger until it was already wrapped around them. Scientists call this prey naivety, and in the Everglades it became a death sentence on a landscape-wide scale. In 2012, a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences handed the scientific world a set of statistics so extreme they strained credulity. Researchers had driven nearly 57,000 kilometers along Everglades area roads between 2003 and 2011, carefully counting wildlife sightings and comparing the results against identical surveys conducted in 1996 and 1997. What they found was not a decline. It was a collapse. Raccoon populations in areas where pythons had established themselves had dropped by 99.3%. Opossums were down 98.9%. Bobcats had fallen by 87.5%. White-tailed deer had declined by 94.1%. Marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes, animals that had been commonly sighted before python populations took hold, were simply not recorded at all. They had functionally vanished from large portions of the park. When those numbers circulated beyond the scientific community and reached the public, the reaction was a mixture of shock and skepticism. A 99% decline in raccoon sightings sounded like the kind of exaggerated figure used to dramatize a point, not a measured scientific result. But the methodology was meticulous, the survey routes were consistent, and independent researchers examining the same question reached similar conclusions. The pythons were not disturbing the Everglades. They were consuming it. To understand the scale of what a single large Burmese python represents as a feeding machine, biologists working in Everglades National Park once modeled the hypothetical diet of a 13-foot specimen. The list included 1 raccoon, 1 opossum, 4 alligators, 5 American coots, 6 little blue herons, 8 ibises, 10 squirrels, 15 rabbits, 15 wrens, 30 cotton rats, and 72 mice. A single animal, 1 python. And in the Everglades at the peak of the invasion, scientists estimated the population numbered somewhere between 30,000 and 150,000 individuals. Female Burmese pythons can lay between 50 and 100 eggs per clutch, and they can do so annually. Every female left uncaught was not merely surviving. She was multiplying the problem exponentially. The math was merciless. Why still, experts estimated that only about 1% of the total python population was ever seen or captured, because these animals are masters of concealment. They rest motionless in dense vegetation for weeks at a time, digest meals slowly, require minimal caloric intake relative to their size, and blend into the patined floor of the wetland with extraordinary effectiveness. The Everglades had been invaded by a ghost that ate everything. By the time organized government response arrived, the damage was already severe. Independent hunters had been pursuing pythons for years, but without coordination or financial support, removal numbers stayed in the low hundreds annually. It was like bailing out a flooding ship with a teacup. That changed in 2017, when the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission established the Python Action Team, removing invasive constrictors, known as Patrick, and the South Florida Water Management District launched its own python elimination program. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structured, paid removal programs employing approximately 50 contracted hunters each, giving them access to public lands and financial incentives tied to the number and size of snakes removed. Hunters earned an hourly rate for active searching time, plus bonus payments for each snake, with larger animals earning more per additional foot of length. The numbers began rising. From roughly 1,600 to 3,000 pythons removed per year between 2017 and 2024, the programs marked steady progress against what remained an enormous and fast-reproducing population. Annual challenges, including the Florida Python Challenge, a 10-day competitive removal event that drew hunters from across the country, added public momentum and media attention to the effort. In 2024, 857 participants from 33 states and Canada removed 195 pythons during the challenge alone. But critics, and even many supporters, understood that these numbers, while meaningful, remained a fraction of what the ecosystem needed. Hunting pressure was being applied, but the python's reproductive rate and the sheer density of the population meant the species was keeping pace. The Everglades needed something more. It needed a breakthrough that changed the economics of removal from the ground up. What came next was the move that made people laugh and then stopped them cold. In 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission made a partnership decision that drew immediate ridicule from some corners and quiet curiosity from others. They aligned Patrick with a Miami-based company called Inversa Leathers, a firm whose entire business model was built on converting invasive species into high-end consumer goods. Inversa sourced materials exclusively from officially verified non-native, harmful species. Burmese pythons from Florida, lionfish from Florida's coastal waters, silverfin carp from the Mississippi River Basin. Every wallet, belt, boot, and luxury item they produced came directly from animals that were destroying American ecosystems. The company's approach was elegantly simple. If you can create commercial value for the removal of invasive species, you change the incentive structure entirely. Hunters would earn more. Removal numbers would rise. The ecosystem would benefit and the fashion world would fund it. The mockery was predictable. Snakeskin handbags saving the Everglades. Luxury wallets as conservation tools. The concept sounded like the kind of proposal that gets laughed out of a grant meeting. What actually happened made those laughs very difficult to sustain. In October 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis stood at a podium reading Python Be Gone and announced results that were, by any measure, stunning. In just 3 months, May through July of 2025, the FWC and Inversa partnership had removed 1,022 pythons from the Everglades. During the same 3-month period in 2024, the number had been 343. The partnership had tripled removals almost immediately. In July 2025 alone, 748 pythons were pulled from the ecosystem, more than the entire previous 12-month total before the partnership began. The program had delivered what was projected to be a 2-year goal in less than 6 months, arriving 1.5 years ahead of schedule. The secret was incentive alignment. Under the new model, FWC contracted python hunters were earning approximately 60% more per snake removed than they had before. The management workload on FWC staff dropped by 8 to 9%, freeing biologists for research and fieldwork. Inversa handled logistics, processing, and the commercial end of the supply chain, converting python skins into traceable products where buyers could verify exactly where the animal was removed. The company described its mission as connecting government invasive species programs to private sector markets, and the results proved the concept worked. By 2025, more than 23,000 wild Burmese pythons had been removed from Florida since the year 2000. The 2025 Florida Python Challenge alone, the 10-day annual competition, saw 934 participants set a new record by removing 294 pythons. The grand prize winner, Taylor Stanberry, captured 60 pythons and took home $10,000. While the Inversa partnership was changing the economics of large-scale removal, a different and perhaps even stranger innovation was quietly reshaping the biology of the hunt on the ground level. Scientists at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida had spent years developing what might be the most counterintuitive tactic in the history of invasive species management, using the pythons themselves to find the pythons. The strategy depends on a well-established behavioral quirk. During the breeding season, male Burmese pythons have one overriding mission: to locate females. They can track a receptive female across vast distances using chemosensory cues, reading the chemical signature she leaves in the environment with extraordinary precision. The Conservancy realized that this instinct could be weaponized against the species. Beginning in 2013, biologists began surgically implanting small radio transmitters into male pythons, animals they called scout snakes, and releasing them back into the wild. The scouts would do what male pythons do. They would search for breeding females. Biologists followed the radio signals, tracking the scouts across a 200-square-mile monitoring area in Collier County. When a scout snake converged with others, clustering in the way pythons do during mating aggregations, researchers moved in and removed not just the scout but the large, egg-laden females it had located. The snake was hunting for them. They were hunting with the snake. The results, accumulated over more than a decade, broke record after record. The 2024 to 2025 breeding season, which runs from November through April to coincide with peak python reproductive activity, produced a haul of 139 pythons weighing a combined 8,080 pounds. That was 4 tons of invasive snake removed from a single relatively contained area in a single season, the highest biomass figure in the program's history. The largest female captured that season measured 17 feet and weighed 153 pounds. Captured females carried an average of 70 eggs each, meaning every female removed represented dozens of future pythons that would never exist. The Conservancy estimated that season alone prevented approximately 4,100 python eggs from entering the wild. The Conservancy's program has now removed 1,750 pythons weighing more than 53,000 pounds since its founding. A fleet of 40 active scout snakes continues patrolling in expanding areas, and long-term monitoring has begun to detect something researchers cautiously describe as a promising signal. In areas of heaviest removal pressure, scout snakes are increasingly struggling to find mates. The females they do find are growing smaller in average size, which may indicate that the largest, oldest, most productive animals are being systematically removed before they can reproduce further. It is worth pausing on the ridicule, because understanding why people laughed reveals something important about how human beings respond to unconventional solutions. When Florida first committed serious resources to python removal, critics called it theater. When bounty programs were announced, commentators joked about tourists hunting snakes for Instagram. When the Inversa partnership surfaced, the image of runway fashion saving an American wetland seemed absurd by design, a punchline waiting to be written. The laughter came from a reasonable place. The scale of the problem seemed so massive, and the proposed responses so unusual, that they appeared disproportionate to the challenge. But the laughter also came from a failure to appreciate the underlying logic. Conventional conservation approaches, public awareness campaigns, restrictive legislation, habitat protection, address the conditions that allow invasive species to spread, but they do not deal with the animals already in the ecosystem. To do that, you need removal. To sustain removal at meaningful scale, you need either government funding alone, which is finite and politically fragile, or you need to build a system where the removal pays for itself. Inverse's model did exactly that. It turned the python from a problem that cost money to address into a resource that generated revenue, which in turn funded more removal, which produced more raw material, which expanded the market. The logic was circular in the best possible way. The Scout Snake program worked on similar logic. Rather than sending biologists on grid searches across a 200-square-mile area of dense wetland looking for an animal that only 1% of hunters ever see, the Conservancy asked, what finds pythons better than humans? The answer was other pythons. The technology was relatively simple, radio telemetry has existed for decades, but the insight required thinking about the problem from inside the snake's perspective rather than from outside it. Neither of these ideas was laughable once the results came in. There were simply solutions that worked. Removing pythons is not the same as restoring the Everglades. The distinction matters enormously. An ecosystem that has lost 99% of its raccoons, most of its rabbits, and significant proportions of its deer, bobcats, and birds does not simply snap back once the predator pressure eases. Recovery is slow, non-linear, and uncertain. Some species may recover relatively quickly once the python population is suppressed in a given area. Others may face such reduced population sizes that genetic bottlenecks become a concern. Some prey species may have adapted behavioral changes, more vigilance, altered foraging patterns, that persist long after the pythons are gone. Wading bird populations, which were not directly hunted by pythons but suffered from the collapse of the mammal prey base that sustained other native predators, face their own uncertain road. The food web of the Everglades is not a simple linear chain, but a network of relationships that took thousands of years to develop. Disrupting it with a century-scale invasive predator caused cascading effects that will take time to understand fully, let alone reverse. What the current removal programs offer is suppression, a meaningful reduction in python population density in targeted areas, particularly in zones where the programs concentrate their efforts most heavily. That suppression creates breathing room. It gives native prey species a chance to begin recovering in pockets of the ecosystem before pythons can recolonize. It gives the native predators, bobcats, alligators, Florida black bears, the occasional Gulf Coast indigo snake that has been documented preying on juvenile pythons, a chance to begin exerting natural pressure on young snakes that enter areas where adult python density has been reduced. The Conservancy has noted that in its monitoring areas, scout snakes are finding it progressively harder to locate mates in zones of intensive removal. That is the biological signal conservationists have been waiting for, evidence that removal pressure is beginning to outpace reproductive replacement in at least some local areas. It is not a declaration of victory. It is the first faint sign that the math might eventually begin to tip. Beyond scout snakes and leather goods, a widening array of tools is being brought to bear on the python problem in ways that would have seemed like science fiction when the invasion began. The so-called robot rabbit represents one of the stranger entries into this toolkit. Solar-powered decoys designed to lure pythons into detection zones are being tested as a way to draw the snakes toward locations where they can be more easily captured or tracked. The device exploits the python's reliance on thermal and chemical cues, offering the signature of prey without any actual animal risk. It sounds bizarre. So did paying hunters to walk into swamps with flashlights 30 years ago, and that turned out to be absolutely necessary. Thermal drone surveys have expanded the ability to locate pythons at night, when the animals are most active and when their thermal profile differs most sharply from